We sing a blessing to the trees. May golden sun shine through your leaves. May rain fall clear and fair winds blow, that ancient forests here may grow. May rain fall clear and fair winds blow, that ancient forests here may grow.
We are a rainforest people who live on a rainforest island. We've just forgotten because we've cut so much of it down. And that's really what I've had an experience in the last decade of remembering and having an ability to revive my own cultural identity around rainforest as a British habitat. The biggest challenge that we face is truly beginning to remember that.
May rain fall clear and fair winds blow, that ancient forests here may grow.
Welcome to the Rooted Healing Podcast, where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and interrelational nature. Today's conversation takes us deep into the wild heart of Cabilla, a sanctuary on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall where ancient Atlantic temperate rainforest still grows, and where Merlin Hanbury-Tenison and his family steward an upland farm. Merlin is the founder of the 1,000-Year Trust, a visionary initiative working to restore Britain's lost temperate rainforests, which are these rich, rare ecosystems that once were integral to these lands on the Wise Isles. And perhaps more than a rewilding project, this is soul work. Cabilla has become a place where people come to remember their place in the web of life, to heal, to recover. There's ecological learning and communion with the forest. Merlin's beautiful book, Our Oaken Bones, is an ode to this journey. Part memoir, part natural history, part cultural remembering. It speaks to what we've lost and what we might yet recover if we dare to root ourselves once more in this oaken remembering and belonging. So I've visited this temperate valley a few times now, and it has truly got this incredible, ancient, deeply nurturing essence with a drinkable sweetwater river, the Badalda, flowing through, and this, I think, wood false brome grass, this ancient grass covering the granite boulders, and these incredibly characterful Celtic oaks who've had to grow from the cracks and crevices of these boulders, making them twist and turn with draping lichens and ivy swaying in the wind. I was actually so moved by my first encounter with this piece of temperate rainforest that I cried and came away and wrote a poem and was processing this experience for days. And I think it's because it's the combination. There's a real essence or spirit to this woodland that feels, it just feels so animate and alive. And also it was the first time in my life that I could go into this river and swim and dip my body into these cool waters and drink without feeling the fear of getting sick. And that was such a deeply moving experience for me. And so I recorded this conversation in person with Merlin. And just to give you a fun little story, we did the episode, we were quite short on time, which is why there was a bit of dog barking at one point, but it's okay, don't worry. It's a beautiful conversation. You can catch all of it. And then afterwards, I went for a swim in the river and it was just gorgeous and I didn't want to leave. And then when I finally did get round to leaving, and I'd already chatted with loads of people on the 1,000-Year Trust team, finally got into my car and my car had broken down. And so we then, of course, started the whole circus of trying all the different things to get it going and all these different jump start leads and realizing that the engine was really strangely designed and just, feeling like a real hassle. But everyone was so lovely. But it just didn't start. And so I ended up spending the entire day in this most beautiful place, and also getting to know Merlin's parents. And his dad is Robin Hanbury-Tenison, who's a well-known explorer and has authored nearly 30 books. And so that was wonderful to get to know him and hear some of his stories. And he's got an incredible archive of stories from his life experiences. So I actually, since this interview, I have also interviewed Robin. Yeah, it was just full of synchronicity and beauty. And I have huge respect and admiration for everyone involved with this project. Really lovely team. And we had lots of conversations because I think Rooted Healing and the 1,000 Year Trust could be a beautiful partnership. We sponsor biodiversity in ancient woodland through the Future Forest Company, but that's quite rooted in Scotland. So now that we're living in Cornwall, I think there may be a shift coming. And so to celebrate this episode, we're giving away a hardback copy of our Oaken Bones to one lucky member of our Patreon community. So if you're not already supporting the show, this is a great time to join. Our patrons are not just keeping the podcast alive, but also receive monthly guided meditations, supportive resources, and lots of lovely gifts like this one. Just a very brief shout out to say we do still have a spot on Earth Medicine, our signature psilocybin retreat in September this year. Do have a gander at our website, rootedhealing.org, if you're curious. So now let's settle in for this rich conversation with Merlin.
Holy trees, giving me everything I need. I find peace, a sanctuary in this bed of leaves.
My name is Merlin Hanbury-Tenison. I'm an author and a conservationist who lives on Bodmin Moor. And I suppose the being that I'd like to bring in at the start of this, we're sitting on the edge of the Kabila Valley, which is a rainforest valley. And these rainforests, the paramount species within them are Celtic oaks, these gorgeous ancient oak trees, which are the most fantastic creatures, which not only can live for 1,000 years, but also can hold hundreds and hundreds, sort of up to 600 species living on them at any one time, which means that unlike many other trees that we have in the UK, they are not single organisms living on their own. They are they're cities, they're communities, they're fizzing and buzzing hives of cacophonous life. So I'd love to bring them in. And then in terms of the rootedness, sort of an origin, is the name Kabila, which a lot of people think of Kabila as, they read it and they think it must be a Spanish word, and people phone up and they say they want to come and stay at Kabila, which I always think would be lovely. But like all of the names that we know down here in Cornwall, which start with prefixes like tre, pol and pen, which are ancient Cornish words for farm, harbour and headland. Kabila is an ancient Cornish word. The original derivative is Carbulia, and it means the land of the woolen cloak. And it has this wonderful history in it that when William the Conqueror came over in 1066, Cornwall was still an independent pagan nation ruled by our last king, King Cadoc. And William killed Cadoc and gave Cornwall to his brother Robert de Mortain, who became the first Duke of Cornwall. And when they did their big census in 1086, the Doomsday Census, they identified, I think it was about 138 ancient farms across Cornwall that all had a duty that they had to do for the king when he passed from England into Cornwall. And the duty of the steward of Kabila, the land of the woolen cloak, was whenever the king crossed over, we had to go and take our finest sheep and shear it and make a fine woolen cloak made from its wool to present to the king at the border to keep them warm and safe and dry from the occasional rain that we get here on our peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic. And when Lizzie, my wife, and I started our business here, Kabila Cornwall, we really wanted to imbue it with that culture and that ethos of making sure that everybody who stayed here, because many people come who are working through a trauma or some sort of challenge in their life, we want them to feel that they are wrapped in the woolen cloak of Kabila, and that they're in a very safe space, they are contained and held, and that lives on, that several thousand year old name is still deeply embedded in everything we're trying to do today on the farm.
Yeah, I love exploring the roots of place and names and the stories that holds and the whole mythic imagination that can come alive when we relate to place in multiple ways. There's a few things I want to pull from your introduction there. The oaks being these absolute, almost like cityscape ecosystems, but also this quite ancient tradition of the woolen cloak. And a lot of what I read in your book and your work with the 1,000 Year Trust feels like you're looking at a compass of time stretched across thousands of years. So maybe let's begin with sheep and with farming and with upland farming and your upbringing, and starting to kind of stretch us into deep time thinking as we unpeel some of the challenges that have come up here, but also how it's evolved to where you are now.
Absolutely, and I think deep time thinking is a concept which is really making a bit of a resurgence, and a great hero of mine is the author Robert Macfarlane, who writes so beautifully, and in his recent book Underland he talks about deep time from the perspective of geology and rocks, the idea of millions of years, and us humans with our very small lifespans living in this very kind of these drops in an ocean of huge swathes of time that go through eons of millions of years, and I find that very, very difficult as a concept to truly, we can all understand it when we read it, but to actually live within it and to consider ourselves, to stand within a landscape and consider ourselves part of many, many million years of growth and evolution. And I find that quite hard to grasp. But whereas for me, it's a slightly smaller deep time because it's focused around oak trees, which are 1,000-year creatures. So whereas a rock might be a 10 million year creature, an oak tree is a 1,000-year creature. And that I can just about grasp. The idea that some of the saplings growing in the Kabila Valley today might be giant mother trees in the year 3025, a time frame so far outside what we as humans would normally consider, but what to an oak tree is a single generation. I find that just about graspable by my small monkey brain, and so that's something which is the reason for the naming of our charity, the 1,000 Year Trust, and the reason for a lot of the work that we're doing here around rainforest research and rainforest restoration is around trying to help humans to perhaps have a holiday from this short-term thinking which we're so locked within, the idea that everything has to be achievable within 2 years or 5 years. You hear conversations of people saying, can we fix climate change by the year 2030? We absolutely can't. But can we fix climate change, or can we get back to a state of planetary equilibrium by the year 3025? Well, yes, we absolutely can. And it won't be viewable by a single generation. It won't be experienced by the next generation or the one after that. But if we can view it in the arc and the sweep of what will our great-great-grandchildren and 20 generations experience, then I think that it not only is more achievable, but I think it's more exciting, it's more optimistic, and it's also true legacy, because I always remember being struck as a child by stories of medieval cathedrals, which the architect who began building it never saw the finished project, and then maybe their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren were part of the project that actually saw the completion of it, and thinking, that's amazing to start something that you'll never see the end of. And there's nothing more applicable and relevant to that than planting oak trees, which you'll never see in their full flush of maturity. So that's really I think the idea behind that deep time sweep. And for my personal, again to your question, Ronnie, around my background here, I grew up on this farm. My father started farming here in 1960, and I was born and brought up on this small upland hill farm. And we're at this really interesting moment, this slight, I hope, handbrake turn moment, this slight kind of moment of change in the way our uplands are managed, way that we view and we use this term cultural identity. And when you refer cultural identity to the idea of deep time, I think the two are actually very at loggerheads, because we humans see cultural identity as something that's quite short term. And I think in the UK, my experience in the UK is that when you talk to people about cultural identity, they generally look back as far as the Second World War. They look back to the late 40s. Maybe people who have a slightly longer view of time might look back as far as the end of the First World War, the sort of the early 1920s, later sort of 1917, 1918. But we struggle to view our cultural identity as anything further than maybe 100 years. Usually it's what our grandparents experienced, and it's very tied up with shifting baseline syndrome, the idea that the world as it was when we were children, or the world as it was when our grandparents or our parents were children, is the way the world should always be. That kind of golden idea of a golden age. And deep time challenges us to think much further backwards and much further forwards. So not what was the world like when my grandparents were alive, but what was the world like 1,000 years ago? And not what might the world be like for my grandchildren, but what might the world be like in 1,000 years' time? And I think sheep sit at the absolute nexus of that challenge, because we've had sheep in the UK for maybe 4,000 years. This is a Mesopotamian, Persian desert creature that was traded along the old Silk Road routes because they're small and easy to transport, and they're quite pliable and pliant. And when I talk to people about it, they say, well, you're mad. You're saying a creature that's been here for 4,000 years isn't necessarily within its native ecological niche. But when you think of the way evolution and Mother Nature work, 4,000 years is a glimmer. It's a moment in time. It's such a fragment of a period, and it's just because we're still looking at it through our human perspective.
And there's something quite ironic about the kabila, this warm woolen cloak, and how farmers these days can't even find a place for the wool. And it's interesting because our ancestral immersions and a lot of the work I've been involved in, we're obsessed with these old crafts of spinning wool and reconnecting to actually wearing the landscapes. But I feel like there's something there as well around that loss of even having that connection with the animals that are on our landscapes. And you've written about how, generally the desire to eat lamb and mutton, and it's on a decline, and it's the most subsidised farming. That's right. In the country, which essentially just means that supermarkets are being subsidised to have cheap meat on the shelves rather than our cultural identity in the uplands. So what have been some of the steps you've done here? What animals have you been bringing in? And perhaps we can draw this into the rainforest and this incredible habitat. There's so much I want to say about this piece of rainforest, this temperate rainforest. But feel free to just weave with me there on thoughts on this transition of Kabila and this awakening and remembrance that this island is an island of temperate rainforest.
Yes, we are a rainforest people who live on a rainforest island. We've just forgotten because we've cut so much of it down. And that's really what I've had an experience in the last decade of remembering and having an ability to revive my own cultural identity around rainforest as a British habitat. So when Kabila is a small upland hill farm. It's about 250 acres, and that's about 80 acres of ancient Atlantic temperate rainforest we've had lots of surveys done. It's about 4,000 years old, which puts it in a very rare category of woodland that is truly ancient in the UK and truly native. All the species within it evolved here. And then it's about 2/3, about 165 acres of grade 4 agricultural grazing land. And the recent history of it is that when Lizzie, my wife, and I moved back we moved back home in about 8 years ago, and we were looking at how you come onto a farm of that size, 250 acres, and an acre is about the size of a football pitch, so that's like 250 football pitches all stitched together, and the average size of a farm in the UK is about 220 acres. So this isn't your kind of James Dyson 33,000 acres of the Cotswolds or a very large area of land. It's a small area of land and the kind of size of farm that really needs to make a living for the family that lives upon it. And so when we came back, there were really two drivers upon us. One was trying to figure out how you make a living from a farm like this, and how you do it in a way which not only honours the land but is restorative to the land, not degrading to the land, but also enables a family to have a life, which is increasingly hard on these upland areas. And so that was one focus. And the other was our own personal journeys for both Lizzie and me around our health and well-being. So I'd previously done a decade or about 8 years in the British Army, and had done 3 tours in Afghanistan, and in 2017 had a mental health breakdown and began to suffer from quite bad complex PTSD. And we were also at that time trying to start a family, and Lizzie was going through a few issues there which are far too far too common and far too little discussed, I think, around women's fertility and the prevalence of miscarriage in pregnancy, and was also suffering from quite poor mental health as well. And we were both receiving huge amounts of benefit from being in the rainforest and being down in the valley and alongside the river. And it was at this time that we were trying to figure out how to make a living from the farm and also receiving huge value personally from the farm, that it began to open up for us what the future might look like. Because every agricultural consultant or every advisor, every neighbour that we spoke to had one very simple message, which was, if you want to make a living from a small upland hill farm, trees are in your way. Cut them down, get rid of them, turn it into more grazing land, put more sheep on it, and maybe you'll get to a sort of economy of scale where you'll have enough livestock on the land that you can extract enough meat, enough wool, if you're doing things like dairy, enough milk, that you can start to have make a living. And not only did that feel like a not just a crime but a sin to cut down any of these trees, which are, yes, there are trees here that have been growing since Henry VIII was on the throne, and the very idea of cutting them down just to put a few more sheep on felt wrong. But also the economics just didn't make any sense. It was not only going to damage the environment, but the average upland hill farmer on Bobbymoor and Dartmoor takes between 85 and 92% of their annual income from European subsidies. This is a hugely subsidy supported way of farming, and not in a way that enriches the farmers. The average age of a farmer around here is 62 because none of the younger generation want to take it over because it's hard work for low returns. It has one of the highest suicide rates of any job type in the UK. And we're seeing more and more abandonment of this kind of land as people struggle to make a living from it. When you look at the economics around sheep farming, you have to shear your sheep every year. It costs £1.30 on average to shear a sheep at the moment. You get paid 25p for the wool, which means farmers are encouraged to either bury or burn their wool because there's no market in taking it to no economics in taking it to a market. And then we export 40% of our lamb. So if it was an important part of our food strategy, our food security, we wouldn't be sending quite so much overseas because it isn't being eaten. And we use 22% of the UK for sheep farming currently, and it provides less than 1% of our calories. This is not a sensible way to use some of our most bioabundant landscapes. So that really sort of sharpened our minds in terms of what the future of farming on these upland areas might look like. And alongside that was the realization not only that this was an ancient Atlantic temperate rainforest, and a term which has only really been used in the last few years, but as we started, as Lizzie and I began to learn more about what makes these rainforests important, first we found that this is one of our most carbon sequestering, climate mitigating habitats that we can possibly restore terrestrially. So more CO2 is sucked into temperate rainforest than anything else in the UK because of all of the epiphytes, the bryophytes, the things living in the canopy. Peat and seagrass are equally as important, but these are all pinnacle habitats that we should be protecting and restoring. We also live in the most nature depleted country in Europe, and nothing can bring back that bioabundance and that diversity as effectively as temperate rainforests. So they're very important for those two. But for us personally, the thing that really stuck out is they are the most effective habitat that we have in the UK for the mental health and well-being of the humans who spend time amongst them. So there are these volatile organic compounds called terpenes and phytoncides that are secreted during the photosynthetic process, especially in these busy, diverse, layered native woodlands. And when we humans breathe them in, so spending just 30 minutes in an Atlantic temperate rainforest, and your cortisol level, your key stress hormone, drops to a level that can still be measured up to 2 weeks later. It boosts our kidney function, our immune system response. It takes us from our sympathetic nervous state, our fight or flight, and helps us move into our parasympathetic nervous state, our homeostasis of rest and digest. So for us, going through our own healing journeys, they were extremely catalyzing and beneficial. And we wanted to not only support that, expand that, protect that, but open it up to other people as well.
Oh, yeah, there's so many threads. And I think I really just want to call in the Bedolder. How do you say it?
The Bedolder.
Yeah, Bedolder. Because I had the most touching, moving experience when I visited here last. And it's such a rare thing to be able to lean down and drink water from a river, especially on these lands, it feels. So maybe can you talk about, let's bring the Bedolder in, talk about the passage of the Bedolder and what makes this water so special. And also from there, I want to expand on this piece of we are rainforest people and this environmental mismatch that you've talked about in your book as well.
So the Budalder is a small river that runs off Bodmin Moor. So if you imagine Bodmin Moor is effectively a giant sponge under pressure, and you've got millions of gallons of water every day being forced through granite, through peat, through moss, and they all bubble up in these upland areas at various spring points. And there's a ridgeline that runs east to west across Bodmin Moor of high ground, and all the water that bubbles up to the north of that ridgeline flows down into the Camel and into the Delank, and a lot of that ends up at the north coast around places like Padstone Rock. And then everything that bubbles up south of that ridgeline flows down into the Foy catchment, and there are lots of these little river valleys that flow off these upland areas and down into the lower ground and all enter the sea at Foy. And so many of the rivers in the UK are now not clean enough to drink from or to bathe in, that these upland rivers are some of the last remaining clean rivers that you can with confidence drink from and lie in and just enjoy without there being any pollutants or any man-made destruction. You can sit on the edge of the Budalder and see otters walking up the river. You can watch beavers making beaver dams in some of the upper areas. There are dippers. There are all kinds of creatures. You can see small trout migrating up the river, and there's a lot of eels, and the life around these rivers is just vast and huge. And Budalder is an old Cornish word that means sweet water, and it does have a real sweetness to it, the flavour of the water. And these really would have once been our rainforest corridors, because when I use the term rainforest, and I try and always use the term rainforest landscape as opposed to rainforest, because I don't want people to feel that the UK was ever once a closed canopy forest environment. I think the idea that a squirrel could once go from Land's End to John O'Groats without touching the ground, that's been very much debunked. We had a whole mosaic of patchwork habitats, everything from closed canopy forest and savanna land and edge habitats and peatland and scrubland and grassland and secondary woodland, and all of these different areas which create the really important diversity that these ancient habitats would have had. But rainforest loves to grow on steep-sided river valleys, and so if you imagine almost like capillaries in a veinous system that all flow down from these upland areas and all join together to make larger and larger rivers that eventually all coalesce into really big rivers that all come out at the sea, these would have all had along their banks these wonderful temperate rainforest connective corridors, which would have all joined up to create migratory routes and hunting routes and diversity routes for genetic mixing and for that kind of the resilience that these habitats would have had. What we've done over the last few thousand years in exactly the same way as is happening in places like Brazil and Colombia and Borneo at the moment, as pristine tropical rainforests are hacked back by subsistence farmers so that species like cattle can be put onto very poor grazing land. And it's worth noting that cattle is a completely non-native species to South America, and the same thing has been happening in the UK for the last few thousand years, where somewhere like Bodmin Moor, a rainforest landscape, has been hacked back to put sheep on these upland areas, a totally non-native species to these islands. And it creates these little miniature island habitats where now our rainforests have gone from being large connective corridors into little 5, 10, 15 acre islands. And when you have these islands, they're like shrinking ink blots. They just get smaller and smaller because they don't have any diversity. They don't have any resilience. If one disease comes in or one non-native like rhododendron or squirrels come in, the rainforest can't cope with that, and it just can collapse and suffocate over a space of a few decades. And so the real mission along rivers like the Budalder needs to be about connecting up the little fragments that remain and bringing that abundance back.
Yeah, thank you. That was so beautifully articulated. And there was one other little piece that when I read your book I thought, oh my goodness, how magical, about the amethyst.
Yes, yeah.
Tell me about that, just because.
Well, it's just beautiful. It's sort of it's more just for fun than anything else. But a lot of the upland areas, Cornwall used to be a massive clay mining area, and in a lot of these clay quarries, you find a lot of semi-precious amethyst. It's one of the sort of not byproducts, but the stone varieties that you find in China clay. And as a child, I would always be going through these clay quarries hunting for the largest amethyst we could find, and I've got loads still on a windowsill in the house of these lumps of amethyst that have come out of clay quarries. And a lot of it is in very small shards, and it ends up being in suspension in the rivers. And so as the rivers flow down, they have quite coarse sandy bottoms on a lot of it, but there's a lot of amethyst shards within that. So it's lovely that when you get into the river, you can really see as the sunlight hits it, this sparkling within the, not just in the water, but in the bed of the river as well. And so you're bathing in these pure rivers surrounded by amethyst crystals. They're very special places.
Yeah, so another thing you've spoken about, and again, just thinking of deep time, because I find a lot of conversations people are having at the moment is about this whole invasive native debate, and when to let nature kind of cross-pollinate and globalize like our human feet have. But the way you described how the oak reacts to spring compared to the beech,
Yes,
was the first time I'd heard of that, and it really animated these families of trees for me. So can you talk about that?
I think the native non-native debate is a really nuanced one, and we always, as humans, we love things to be binary. We love them to be simple. Is that old saying that every complex problem has a simple solution that won't work? And it's so true. And the easiest way to be quite binary about it, of looking at the UK and looking at native versus non-native, is that we had the last glacial maximum 8,500 years ago, when we were still connected to mainland Europe. There was this land bridge between Lincolnshire and northern Germany, and then there was a giant earthquake in Norway. A lot of the ice shelf collapsed. The sea level rose. That started a moment alongside the warming that was happening of sea level rise. And Doggerland, this area of low-lying dry ground between Lincolnshire and Germany, flooded. And that was when we became an island habitat. And really, the clock starts at that point. Of anything that was in the UK then is a native species. Anything that's been brought in since then is a non-native. But of course, it's a complex system, because there are some species which we consider to be naturalized, things like sycamore, and we go, they've been here for so long that really it should be considered to be a good proxy for the ash. And maybe that's right, but also I'm not a deep dendrologist who's able to look at the effects that these trees have on other trees, and maybe there's a lot that we don't know. There probably is. In fact, there certainly is. And maybe something is happening in these systems when non-natives are brought in that isn't entirely positive. But we've also brought in a lot of diseases like ash dieback and Dutch elm disease, where we have to be able to supplement where certain native varieties don't survive anymore. There would also have been transmission of non-natives by natural means. Birds come across with seeds. They swallow things and then they defecate, and you have things being brought across small stretches of water like the English Channel in that manner. Some beetles will be blown across in storms. So there's always a slight waviness around native, non-native, but I'm always struck by the appetite and comfort that some island nations, places like Australia and New Zealand, Tierra del Fuego, the Chagos Islands, have around identifying what is introduced by people and what is native to that environment. In New Zealand, they have competitions amongst school children to sort of kill and bring in the most number of rats or possums or non-native creatures, so that, and the children will get prizes for it. I just imagine if we tried to do that in the UK and get school children to bring in the most number of squirrels, that the grey squirrels that they'd dispatched, I think there'd be absolute there'd be a big outcry. And I think we need to be a little bit more comfortable with the idea of identifying things as native and non-native. And with our oaks, it's really noticeable. So our native varieties of tree, they do wonderful things. They integrate using the mycelial network. They coppice, they mast, they hold abundance within their canopy. And then we've brought in many non-native varieties, and beech is one of them. But then also things like Sitka spruce and Douglas pine, which just hold so much less abundance within their canopy, and do less for climate mitigation, less for bioabundance, less for human mental health and well-being. And I believe that it would be a really lovely thing if in the UK we were a bit less nature blind and a bit more comfortable with looking at the natural world and going, that has been here for a very long time. Whereas that was brought in by the Victorians, for example, because they thought it was pretty, and it's doing quite a lot of damage. And I think that's the first step towards us being more integrated within natural systems rather than sitting apart from them.
Yeah, because your book's called Our Oak and Bones, which is such a good title. And there's something about the oak tree that I think many of us, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, associate our cultural identity with
Heart of oak,
on these British Isles. And there's something so sad about the thought of oak decline, rapid oak decline, and losing the oaks. And I remember being at a festival last summer, and Mac McCartney did a talk about oak decline and how he was recognizing these antler shapes at the top of the oak trees, which is the first sign of their retreating and dying back. And behind the stage at this festival after his talk, I saw all the oaks with the deer antler shapes above, and my heart was just breaking. I could cry thinking about it. So what are your thoughts on that? And I feel, because meeting you has been this real wave of active hope, this sense of, oh my goodness, there's so much belief that we can stretch and expand these ancient habitats.
Yeah.
So maybe just riff with me there.
I mean, I refuse to be pessimistic about it. I've seen so much eco-anxiety and inertia and depression about it, and I see that, and I absolutely recognize it, and I honor it, and I don't judge anyone who feels that way, but I refuse to feel that way myself, because I see us as a part of this system, not the dominant species within it. And so even if humanity starts to have a really rough time because of things that we have done, that doesn't mean that the natural world won't maintain the ability to bounce back. And that's coming back to that idea of deep time. And actually, if you force yourself to think in a deep time way, and I sort of slightly jokingly make this point in the book around how if you try and take yourself out of your current circumstance and imagine what the UK will be like in the year 3025, 1,000 years from now, I think it's absolutely, well, we have a choice of what we think the UK will be like in 3025. You might think it will be a hideous kind of barren desert or sort of hellscape, but I believe that that's a large enough amount of time that nature will have been given an opportunity to bounce back. Humans might have done terrible things to themselves and have reduced their population heavily, but nature has a wonderful resilience and a way to return. And so if we put ourselves in that place where in 3025 we accept that there will be a lot more natural world in the UK, a lot more wilderness, better populations of things that we've lost, like beavers and lynx and wolf, all of the keystone species that have been removed that are needed for the harmonious running of the natural world. There'll probably be fewer humans. I hope there are fewer humans, but I hope there are still humans, and I hope that they are living within harmony and in a much more nature integrated way. And so if that's the end state in 1,000 years, or not the end state, but the next relevant moment in time in 1,000 years, then I believe the next question is how we get from where we are now, from A, to where that is in B. And I believe there are a million versions of what might happen between now and then. But if we see two core arcs of time, one looks very like a Mad Max movie, and it involves lots of cannibalism, lots of leather, lots of war and plague and drought and famine and horrible things happening. And that will happen for the next 200, 300, 400 years. And then there will be so few people at the end of that those that are left will start to rebuild and start to learn to live with nature a bit more effectively and remember how to, even things that we've only lost in the last few generations, like how to, grow wheat and make bread, or how to forage from the land, what mushrooms and what berries can be eaten, skills that used to be so ubiquitous and now are so rare. These will have to be relearned, and then eventually we'll be at a point in 3025 where we live in harmony with nature. But it will be horrible and traumatic for humans. If we imagine the other alternative, which is that we all start now just making small incremental changes and large changes where appropriate, and we all start living a little bit more in step with nature and with the natural world and considering ourselves a part of, not apart from Mother Nature and this beautiful, fragile planet that we live upon, then we can get to that same endpoint without the Mad Max chapter at the start. And I think that's the only real decision we have to make. And that's a really optimistic choice, because we sit here and go, well, how do we want to get to 3025? How do we want our great 20 generations grandchildren to get to 3025? Is it with lots of pain and trauma, or is it with lots of integration and harmony? And I think that is a message of realism, but also a message of positivity and hope.
Yeah, and I'm glad you made that distinction that we are a part of nature, because I think it's quite easy to have that binary separation between humans and the rest of nature when we talk about conservation and things. And you've mentioned what some people call zoochosis, and this idea of being so extracted out of our original habitat. So maybe again, I just want to bring us back. I love that we are rainforest people
Yes.
on these isles.
I think it is the biggest challenge that we face is truly beginning to remember that. And it's something that I talk to everybody who comes to Kabila about. And I see the look of disbelief, the look of confusion, the look of sometimes anger on their faces. And it's a Judeo-Christian hangover. I mean, it's from the sort of the Pauline approach to our place within the natural world. When they were translating the original Bibles, they had a choice around this word in Genesis, dominion or stewardship, and how do we sit within the natural world? Are we the dominant species, or are we a very intelligent and powerful species as a result that is here as a part of that natural system? Are we at the top of a pyramid, or are we within a big sort of shifting and flowing fluid, and we're just one substance within that? And I'm passionate about helping people to remember this, that we are a part of nature, not apart from it. But I'm also passionate about the next step, because what I've realized is that it's a very well used trope that we're a part of nature. That's fine. I think everybody tends to eventually agree and go, yes, okay, we are one species of many. We have evolved out of the same starting blocks as everything else, and we have a place within these systems. But I think the exciting next step is, what does that actually mean? For us as humans, how should we actually therefore behave? What does not being an observer of the natural world but being a participant look like? Especially if you look at the UK, where we have 70 million people in the UK. How do we encourage 70 million people to view themselves as participants in the natural world, not just observers, in a positive and non-damaging way? How do we become ecosystem engineers and keystone species and even apex predators without doing that in a way that degrades the natural world around us? And that, I think, is the fun challenge. And that's the challenge that I really focus my time and attention on, is trying to help people to see what that might look like.
Yeah, and one of the most low budget, biggest shifts we could consider that you've mentioned when people ask you this, what is actually realistic in terms of government supporting that shift, is thinking more about eating venison and having that relationship again with the deer, with the forest, with the hunter. That's a huge shift. I mean, people listening to the podcast know that I'm a recovering vegan. And for about 3 years now, or 4 actually, I've been eating meat. And one of the main transitions was working with venison and really allowing myself to feel that predator energy and return to the cycles of life. It's a huge psychological identity shift. So maybe there's something to speak to there around the share to spare debate and actually really partaking in the world, and what shifts can we make?
I truly believe that future generations will look back upon the industrialized farming complex as one of the greatest evils that we have ever created as humans, from a great list of many evils, but this being, I think, one of the biggest. And we talked about this, Ronnie, when you were last here, around an absolute, I believe, essential book for anybody, especially people considering veganism or vegetarianism, both life choices that I hugely admire. But a man called Henry Mance wrote this wonderful book called How to Love Animals. He says, well, actually what we should do, if you want to be logical about it and rational about it, is give up dairy first, because dairy is a very peculiar industry. The fact that we are wrenching newborn calves and other species away from their mothers as soon as they're born, simply so we can have this product as adults, is quite perverse and very strange. And then definitely give up industrialized meat that is pumped full of antibiotics and steroids and grown through cruelty and misery. But sustainably sourced wild meat is the most natural thing in the world. And I always find it interesting that we're very comfortable talking about humans as hunter-gatherers, and for the 400,000 years of Homo sapiens existence, 99% of that has been spent as hunter-gatherers. So we're happy to say, oh, we're hunter-gatherers, but then we forget very quickly what the hunter part actually means, which is that we have spent the majority of our history hunting wild animals and sourcing their meat in very kind and very sustainable ways. And we now live at a time where our deer population in the UK is so far outside of its carrying capacity and its equilibrious range that there are meat solutions that don't involve buying factory farmed pork or chicken or beef, but that can involve actually getting meat which is the same kind of meat, sourced in the same kind of way that we have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I could really imagine that being quite a tangible shift in our collective spirit to return to more wild meat, because, yeah, you share some facts and statistics about the industrial agriculture. It's just such a painful thing to have happening right now.
And I don't believe it will continue. I think that our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will look back at some of the ways that we have lived and previous generations have lived and think they were very perverse. And I remain positive that the time of this continuing is coming to an end, because we are waking up to what strange choices that we've made and what strange things we're doing to some of the creatures that we live alongside.
Yeah. Yeah, this returning and remembering. You said that word a few times. There's something I'm realising, actually, that we've dived in and perhaps not started at the sort of basic understanding of what makes a temperate rainforest.
Yes.
Because a lot of people think, obviously, we dart off to the tropical rainforests. And I think it's so beautiful that your dad has been this renowned explorer of tropical rainforests, and here you are saying, hold on, we have temperate rainforests right here. So maybe let's just backtrack a little bit and explain that, if anyone who's...
Well, I suppose it's another area that I'm absolutely committed to as a direction. And what I want to see, I have 2 small daughters, and my hope is that when they are doing their GCSEs or certainly when they're grown-ups, that as a society, dogs going off all over the place, as a society, as a culture, we will be very comfortable with the idea that there are many types of rainforests, but the 2 core ones are tropical and temperate rainforests. And we've all grown up at school, and whether you're 8 years old or 80 years old, we know that there are these things called rainforests, that they are the lungs of the planet and that they are hugely important. But when we think of that, we are thinking of tropical rainforests. And the reason we think of these is twofold. One, we've cut down 50% of the world's tropical rainforest, but there's still 50% left. So there is the destruction is less complete. And secondly, because so much scientific research and analysis has been done of these tropical rainforest habitats that we know how important they are. When we think of temperate rainforests, and there are many temperate rainforest zones across the UK, there's the Eastern Pacific temperate rainforest range of places like British Columbia and Alaska. There's the Western Pacific northern range with Japan and South Korea. Then if you go down to the southern hemisphere in those areas, you've got places like Tasmania and New Zealand. And then you have places around the eastern seaboard of Canada and the United States, Newfoundland, Labrador, and some of sort of New England. Then a lot of places like Patagonia and Chile. These are all temperate rainforest zones, but then that Atlantic temperate rainforest zone, which would have run from Bergen in southwest Norway all the way down through from the Highlands of Scotland down through Cumbria and the Lake District, along the western reaches of Wales, through Anglesey, Aberystwyth and Pembrokeshire, the southwest of the UK, a lot of Ireland and Brittany and Galicia, and then northern Portugal down as far as Braga. So this was one of the core temperate rainforest zones, and the reason we don't know about it as a habitat is, one, because whilst we've only cut down 50% of the world's tropical rainforest, we've cut down 99% of the temperate rainforest in the Atlantic zone. And the second is that no one's doing any scientific research on it. So it's not taught when we're at school. It's not in our curriculum or our syllabuses. And so we are rather blind to it. And these rainforests are native woodlands. So they are filled in the UK mainly. They're either hazel or oak woodlands. There's some Scots pine woodland as well that is temperate rainforest. A lot of birch and alder and ash and rowan, these wonderful ancient trees, but mainly oak, and a lot of it is either pedunculate or sessile oak, the Celtic oak. And you have to have a lot of rainfall in these habitats, so they need to receive at least 1,400 millimeters of rainfall a year, and it can't all fall in one big monsoon dump in December. It has to fall in a staggered effect throughout the year, and that's because that rainfall supports all of that epiphyte growth, which is so important, the epiphytes and bryophytes that thrive in these rainforest habitats and are so effective for both providing habitat for things to live in, but also sequestering CO2. And then that also, because these rainforests tend to be older and tend to be more integrated and more native, you have a lot of that mycelial growth in the soil. So whilst mycelium isn't part of the designation of temperate rainforest, they tend to go hand in hand, that you end up with a lot of that organic matter that connects these habitats together. And that's why I want to remind people that what's really important in woodland, it is the diversity of trees, the providence of those trees, but it's also the age of the woodland, not the individual trees. So if you think of the Kabila Valley, which is a 4,000-year-old forest with multiple generations of death and life and collapse and regrowth and life and all of this wonderful mix, and then all of the mushroom, the fungal growth beneath it, when you walk through a 100-year-old woodland or a 200-year-old woodland, you are walking through a big patch of mud with 1,000 trees all pointing at, or standing in the ground. When you walk through a temperate rainforest, you're basically walking over one giant mushroom with 10,000 fingers all pointing up in the air. It is one integrated, connected habitat.
Yeah. And you can see the lichens draping off like curtains, like the ivy hangs down. It's incredible.
And a lot of these lichens, especially the really draping ones like the Usnea articulata, which is old man's beard lichen, they're bioindicators. So they only grow where the air is completely pure. So it can be they're like the canary in the coal mine, these rainforests. They can really show us where nature is in a state of health and where it is in a state of dysregulation and dis-ease.
Yeah, I think it was Elon Musk who tweeted, I will give, I don't know, something billion pounds to whoever can invent a carbon extraction technology. Off you go.
Yes.
And someone replied, well, how about a forest?
Yeah. How about what Mother Nature's been doing for millions of years? It's amazing the way we look to these technological solutions because we think they'll be easier. When actually the solution sits in front of us, it just takes a little bit of a shift in the way we view the planet and the way we live our lives.
And there's something, a huge amount of companies and organisations are jumping on the tree planting train. But you have written about that being not as straightforward as often seems. Not that we want to demoralise anyone who does put the effort or resources towards that, but maybe share a little about the process of expanding such a habitat.
And this is what we're trying to do here at Kabila with the 1,000-Year Project, which is really our blueprint site. And planting a tree is so easy.
Yeah.
You dig a hole in the ground, you stick it in, you fill that in afterwards. It's almost, I sometimes compare it to raising a child. Making a child is very easy and quite enjoyable. Actually, the next sort of 15 years of that child's life is really hard, and that's the challenging bit. And a tree is the same. Anyone can plant a tree, but getting a tree to a point where it's actually able to thrive on its own, it's like raising a child. And we've re-established 100,000 trees here in the Kabila Valley, planted 40,000, 60,000 are due to come back through natural colonization. But actually the next 15 years is the really pivotal time. It's not getting them in the ground, it's keeping them alive, keeping them healthy and bringing them up. And lots of companies that are now looking at their ESG or CSR reports and just having their shareholder reports, and they just want to have statistics and numbers. And I've had so many conversations with organizations who say, oh yeah, great, we want to plant trees. In fact, we pay 50 cents for every tree we plant. We've planted millions of trees, mangrove plantations in Southeast Asia. And you say, great, have you been to visit them? No, we don't need to. Right, is there anyone auditing it? No. Are you sure that no one else is planting in the same area and it's just being multiply sold? Because you can't plant a tree for 50 cents and then forget about it and assume that it's going to be fine for the next 15 years. So much of the tree planting that companies think they're doing is either being done poorly or not being done at all, or it's being sold multiple times, or it's just outsourcing a problem which we could be solving here. We are a rainforest island. Why are British companies not spending a little bit more, but actually having the opportunity to come and do it rather than just paying money and knowing and hoping that it's being done at the other side of the planet? We have an opportunity here to engage everyone who works in organizations to actually come and get their hands dirty and be a participant of the natural world, and then come back and visit those trees and one day sit under them when they've retired. How amazing could that be, rather than just pressing send on a payment request for 10,000 trees in a mangrove plantation which probably aren't being planted or might get cut down 2 years later, or may all just be planted then die, which is what happens in a lot of these planting schemes.
Yeah, I thank you for naming that, because I feel such a calling for us all to just come home, what's within our reach and what's tangible and tactile. And these trees need care, and there's so much reforesting to do here on these isles. I want to go a little bit deeper into your healing journey and also Lizzie's, I feel like that would be very apt on this podcast. Maybe you can share a little bit about the story. I mean, the stark contrast of the landscapes you have known as a part of your work, and then this coming home and the healing with the rainforest, and this emotional level of meaning we can have as being a part of these habitats.
I think I think about the way I absorb information and things that really stick with me and kind of hook with me. And I love horror as a genre. I always think it's really compelling. Very hard to tell good horror stories. Very easy to tell kind of lazy sort of slasher horror stories. But the stories that really stick with you and you're still thinking about 2-3 weeks later, I always love kind of unpicking that and trying to figure out why that story landed. And one of the things that I think works really well is a sudden kind of contrast that really shakes people and shocks them. And it's something that I've tried to do in the book around writing about Afghanistan and these desert environments, and then suddenly switching to writing about temperate rainforest environments, because I don't believe you can find greater contrast between two different habitats. One which is a very challenging environment to find any life in, and life tends to be nasty, brutish and short, and then one which is so full of life and so abundant and so healthy and so green compared to the browns and the greys of the desert, that you end up with this wonderful contrast. And for me, that was something which was very real as a lived contrast. I talk a lot, and I've spoken with many people about PTSD and the realities of some of these mental health conditions that are becoming very prevalent. We've cycled, I believe we cycled about 100,000 people through the war in Afghanistan. We had about 10,000 people stationed there throughout the bulk of the campaign, but that changes every 6 months, and some people would return. But I think over the space of the time we had there, about 100,000 of our soldiers, sailors and airmen spent time there. And the butcher's bill of mental health afterwards is very high, just like we saw after the First and Second World War, the Americans experienced after the Vietnam War. We have lost more soldiers since the Falklands War to suicide than died in that campaign.
Wow.
More soldiers have died in the last 40 years due to suicide than have died in any of the campaigns that the military has faced. Suicide remains the leading cause of death in men under 50 globally. And these are issues which I don't think are discussed enough, and I don't think we understand enough about the way things like PTSD, depression and anxiety work, especially in the male mind, which can be very different. Men are not often as good at talking about their issues, sharing their issues, receiving help for their issues, and receiving the help that they need. And I'm always keen to talk about what a mental health problem might look like. And I think PTSD, we have an idea of it being people jumping when a car backfires, or having these kind of very visceral flashbacks and being pulled back into moments. And it's different for everybody. And for me, actually, that sensory element of spending 7 months, and I did that 3 times over, in an environment where there's only the same smell, the same taste, the same touch, the same sound, the same sensations. There was no diversity of sensory experience, and then suddenly being thrown into a temperate rainforest environment where the sensory experiences are extremely kind of fulfilling, can really change what's happening with your neuroplasticity. And that's even worse when you're taken from a war zone into maybe a heavily urban environment, or a kind of a social environment where you're in a pub or a nightclub where there's a lot of stimuli. And I've spoken to many people who've really suffered with that, and it's not so much the car backfiring or the flashbacks, it's more just actually your body being wrenched from one set of sensory stimuli into another. And that's where I think these native, or I know because I've seen the science around it, that some of these woodland sensory methods, things like forest bathing and some of the other work that we do here at Kabila, can be very healing, because it's putting us back to our most visceral, atavistic and innate set of sensory cues that can help to really reset us and put us back into a state of homeostasis. And that's what I experienced here at Kabila. I was very young when I went to Afghanistan on my first tour. I was 21 years old, and I did some training before we left in trauma risk management, in mental health, in being able to identify when there was a mental health challenge, either in yourself or in any of your soldiers. And I remember the instructor saying that it can sometimes take up to 10 years for a traumatic incident to manifest into a mental health condition. And I remember so vividly sitting in this lecture hall listening to this as a 21-year-old and thinking, don't be so utterly ridiculous. If I'm unwell, I'll know pretty much immediately, or certainly within a few months. I can't imagine that 10 years would need to pass. But I think it's so important to know that actually many mental health conditions do take a long time to manifest and to percolate and to then come to the surface. And that was certainly what I experienced. So I did 3 tours in Afghanistan, and it was on the first tour that I was blown up by a Taliban roadside bomb. And I was in a light armoured vehicle driving through the desert of Helmand province, in between the towns of Sangin and Musa Qala, and we were blown up by a very large anti-tank mine, which totally destroyed my very small, very old, very rickety armoured vehicle. And really, everybody who assessed the incident site was amazed that we were not only alive, but that we had all of our limbs. Traditionally, when this sort of incident happens, the explosion will happen underneath the vehicle, and a scab of metal peels off because of the shock wave from inside the metal and bounces around inside. That's how these mines are designed. They're not necessarily designed for the mine to act, or the explosives to actually destroy the vehicle, but they create this projectile inside the vehicle that bounces around, and everything is sharp and metal and hard, and that slices bodies up and knocks off limbs and opens up arteries, and that's what creates a lot of the carnage. And often after an incident like this, you open up the vehicle and you just find a really horrible, gruesome scene inside. And that didn't happen to us. We were extremely lucky in many ways. One, that didn't happen. Secondly, my gunner and I were thrown out of the vehicle, caught and pulled back in, but we were surrounded by shrapnel and none of that hit us, and that was a miracle in itself as well. And it was an incident that we were hugely fortunate to survive, and one that I'm grateful every day to still be here. And whenever things feel very difficult, and running a small business on Bodmin can sometimes be very difficult, I just remind myself that no one's losing a leg today, and we're all still here. And then it was that was in 2007, and it was 10 years almost to the day after that incident, and I'd been fine and felt very confident in how fine I was, both physically and psychologically, and returned to Afghanistan on a second tour and did another 7 months out there, and returned on a third and did another 6 or 7 months out there, and always felt very proud of the fact that I'd been through some of these incidences and not felt any damage as a result of them. And it was 10 years after, in 2017, that I had a mental health breakdown, and I don't attribute that entirely to that incident. I think it was part of it. We love, again, for mental health to be a simple thing. This happened to you, therefore this is the condition you have. You were in a car crash, you now have PTSD. You had a traumatic birth as a woman, and therefore you now have postnatal depression or anxiety. We love to kind of associate an action with an outcome. But actually, mental health is always complex and confusing. And I was working in a really unpleasant, high pressure, high stress, poor paid job in London at the time. And I believe that had a huge contribution to what happened. So, but the explosion was definitely a large part of it as well. And I'm very grateful to have come through it, and very grateful that I had the rainforest to come and recover in. And that really was a large part of then what has gone on to both founding Kabila Cornwall and the 1,000 Year Trust, was having this rare, ancient and precious habitat to heal within, and realising that the most important work that I could do, and that Lizzie and I could do, was opening it up for other people to heal in as well, but in a way that always protected the habitat and made sure the habitat improved year on year as well. We didn't what we've seen so many times in so many places, how when certain areas get opened up for humans, we can damage them, especially very beautiful sites that are Instagrammable. And one I always think of is, I remember the film The Beach coming out, and in the years following that beautiful beach in Thailand was ruined by people coming to take photographs on it. We can be like locusts, or we can be very healing. And we wanted to try and walk that tightrope at Kabila of bringing as many people here to heal as possible. Veterans with PTSD, nurses from the NHS with stress and burnout, other people suffering from fertility issues or any kind of problem, but always seeing the rainforest as our principal client and watching the rainforest heal as the people healed. And we've now had over 3,000 people stay in the Kabila rainforest, and the rainforest is tripling in size. Species are returning. We're reintroducing things that are missing, and we're watching the abundance of that habitat grow with every day as well.
In many ways, this feels like an indigenous way of thinking. How do we think intergenerationally? How do we become good ancestors? How do we live our lives? And in many ways as well, this sense of a deeper time thinking also feels like a weight off our shoulders, that we don't have to do it all at once in this one wild and precious life, that we can do it intergenerationally, and we can pass on in so many intricate and magical ways, and infuse the next generation with this love and participation with nature.
And that's absolutely the way I feel about it. And I didn't originally. I used to feel a lot of stress and anxiety around the work we were doing here, and a sense that I had to complete the project and get it done. And so many things happen when you're trying to re-establish 100,000 trees and bring back a rainforest and bring people into the valley as well, that are outside of your control. In fact, nearly everything is outside of your control. And I've now become much better at just realizing that we're just moving slowly, and we're doing everything we can day by day. And some days will be positive and some days will be negative and challenging. Some days will feel like steps forward, some will feel like steps back. But really, if you view the broad arc of time as a sort of a relay race, with each generation passing the baton on to the one after it and taking the baton from the one before it, all we can really do is make sure that we pass the baton on, and the baton is planet Earth, in a slightly better condition and state than we received it from the one before. And if we do that incrementally, and we just are able to lie on our deathbeds going, we've passed it on a little bit better than we found it, then over the space of the next 20, 50, 100 generations, we can get back to the place that the planet should be in. And so I think that intergenerational deep time thinking can be really positive. And you mentioned Mac McCartney at the start. He's such a great man, and he really works hard. And I want to make sure I don't look like I'm claiming this, because I learnt it from him, and he learnt it from Native American Indian tribes who are the real proponents of it, of the concept of the children's fire.
Yeah.
And the idea that every decision we make should really be rooted in the benefit to the children's 7 generations' time. And I, as a parent, I think about this a lot. I look at my daughters, and I desperately want them to live in a world which is better than the world that I live in. Not because the world we live in is terrible, but just because I want it always to be improving. And then I hope that I will get to know my grandchildren, if I have grandchildren, and I will want them to live in a better world than the one their parents lived in. And if I'm really lucky, some people get to meet their great-grandchildren, and we'll hope the same for them. But I believe that's pretty much where it stops. You can't pretend that you really care about your great-great-grandchildren or your great-great-great-grandchildren, because they're a nebulous concept. They're an idea in the distance. But trying to think in multi-generational ways of going, what world do I want my children in 7 generations' time to live within? That I think is quite exciting.
So I'd love to ask Loveday what she thinks about, what's her favourite thing about the rainforest.
She loves, we go on little rainforest expeditions all the time, and I remember at her age doing the same with my father and spending time in this valley, and I love watching her. I mean, she knows the natural world almost better than I do now. She picks out birds that I don't know the name of them, and she's able to identify them, and turns 5 in a couple of months, so she's very young. And it's wonderful just seeing her walking through this rainforest barefoot, as though it is her natural habitat. And then when friends or people come to stay who bring their own children, and their discomfort at the idea of mud or dirt or where there might be germs, and that makes me very sad. And I want we need our young people to feel at home in the natural world, because if they do, then they'll always want to protect it, because they'll always love it. And so we need to get them out and into it.
Yeah. Oh, so beautiful. There's so much. Having just read your book, which is gorgeous, I really recommend it. There's so much I want to keep drawing out, but I just implore everyone to go and read your book instead, to get the full story, or at least as full as it is in the book.
Please do. It's been a really interesting process. It's my first book, and I'm beginning to meet people who've read it, but complete strangers who've read it, who come up and they say, I've read your book, and how's Gloria, and how's Elsa, and how's Kabila, and how's your father, and how's Lizzie, and they sort of talk to you as though they know you, and I'm becoming very comfortable with this. Something I found quite uncomfortable at the start, the idea that it's now out there as a message, and I just want it to fly and hopefully land with people in the right way, because it is a very personal story, but it's also a very national story. It's one that I think we should all read and get behind and be aware of.
Yeah. And the 1,000-Year Trust, I know you've got a crowdfunder
We do.
going on at the moment, so maybe talk a little bit about that.
So I mentioned earlier about how we're so familiar with tropical rainforests, and one of the reasons for that is they're so well researched. And it is true that if you are a young conservation scientist, and I have 4 of them in the office right now who are all working with our team, that if you're a young conservation scientist and you want to study and give your work to studying rainforests, you're probably going to do that in tropical rainforests, which makes sense because there's so much more of them. But there are also hundreds of universities with dedicated courses to tropical rainforests, and dozens of research institutes providing millions of pounds of funding, and dozens of field stations, most importantly, where you can go to Costa Rica or Borneo or Peru or Brazil and stay within a tropical rainforest and join multi-year, multidisciplinary research programs and contribute to peer-reviewed papers and shift societal opinion and government policy. And that is why we all know how important the Amazon is, and we all know how important tropical rainforests are. If you want to give your research or your career over to temperate rainforest, there isn't a single university course, a single research institute providing funding, or a single field station. And so we've just launched a crowdfunder to build Europe's first Atlantic temperate rainforest research field station, a site here on Bobbin Moor, right in the heart of the temperate rainforest bioclimatic envelope, where scientists, students, researchers, professors, people from all over the world will be able to come and stay on the edge of a really beautiful slice of temperate rainforest and actually get the data behind its climate mitigating potential, its biodiversity potential, and its mental health and well-being efficacy, which is such important work. So I would really encourage everybody not only to read Our Oaken Bones, but also to please support our charity where you can and talk to friends and family about it, because it's exciting work, and I encourage everyone to come and see us and see what we're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, also, people can come and stay at Kabila. My very dear friends are getting married here this summer. I'm so excited. We'll be staying on site for, I think, 3 nights. And so there's so many invitations, and everything will be linked in the show notes. Thank you so much, Merlin.
Thank you.
This has been such a pleasure.
For me too. Thank you very much.
Oak, oak, oak of old, King of trees in your crown of gold, you are the door to worlds unseen, in winter bare and in summer green.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. Head to rootedhealing.org to learn more about our work and to join us at a gathering or on a course. All healing, tending and connecting our inner and outer landscapes through an embodied, animistic, deep ecology. You can also visit patreon.com/rootedhealing to keep these conversations in your ears. Thank you so, so much to all who are already filling that space. The music in this episode is from The Children's Forest and Bonnie Medicine. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.
Summer green. And when you wear your autumn crown, blue-feathered jay from your branches sounds. From cradles high your acorns fall, so young may grow or to nourish all.